Welcome to this July edition of the Australia-New Zealand Women's Declaration International webinar. My name is Janet Fraser and I'm the convener of the Feminist Legal Clinic in Exile. Our principal solicitor Anna Kerr is doing tech with Kate Williamson, so thanks to those women. I live and work on Darug and Gundungurra outside of Sydney. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations across this continent. We have an exciting panel this evening. Speakers from the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, whom I'll introduce in turn. Coalition of Activist Lesbians Australia is a national autonomous community-based group working to investigate, comment on and advocate for the equitable inclusion of lesbian women in Australian life. They are informed by human rights principles and by feminist perspectives and are in dialogue with other like-minded and general community groups internationally, nationally and locally. COAL has participated in the international arena, being an accredited non-government organisation with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, as well as the Division for the Advancement of Women. It should be noted that to date, COAL is the only lesbian-specific non-government organisation in the world to have this accreditation. In federal, state, territory and local government jurisdictions, COAL has been involved in promoting participation and equity for lesbian women in public, private and community sectors. COAL lobbied at the UN Fourth World Conference on Women, Beijing 1995, and co-hosted the first international lesbian space tent at the 1995 NGO Forum. And now to introduce our excellent panel. Bronwyn Winter lives on Gadigal and Wongal land, but today she is speaking to us from Gerinja land. She is a Professor Emerita of Transnational Studies and a long-time feminist, lesbian and trade union activist in France, Australia, briefly in the UK, and transnationally. Her interdisciplinary academic work has covered various themes, but addressing various forms of violence against women has always been a core preoccupation. Her most recent book is The Political Economy of Same-Sex Marriage, a Feminist Critique. Thank you, panel, and welcome. I'm very thrilled to have you all. We're going to start with Bronwyn. Bronwyn, please, over to you.
I'm assuming everyone knows what ECOSOC's special consultative status is, but I will go into it a little bit because it was a big deal because COAL, as Janet said, was the first lesbian organisation. And unless the Australian Lesbian Medical Association remains accredited, remains the only lesbian organisation in the world, or if ALMA is still accredited, one of the only two, and they're both from Australia, so how about that? Special consultative status means we get to talk to UN diplomats, we get access to UN buildings and conferences, we can attend conferences in areas of our speciality, which is, women, gender, blah, blah, homosexuality, of course. And so that's sort of a big deal. And it sort of a little bit reflects some of the priorities of the co-founder of COAL, a woman named Eileen Pittaway, who has worked quite a lot on women refugees and asylum for women fleeing sexual violence, among other things. And Eileen was very, very centrally involved in NGO coordination in the Asia-Pacific region. And so when she co-founded COAL, one of the first priorities was to get us on the UN agenda and get us into the UN, and also with the Beijing World Conference coming up in 1995. And as Janet already explained, COAL was centrally involved in the NGO space. Unfortunately, myself, I did not get to the conference. I had other things going on at the time, including finishing a PhD, and I had no money. But I was at the COAL launch at Clover Business Women's Club in Sydney, which was a sort of middle-class sort of lesbian venue in Sydney, but it was a great place to host parties. So that was where COAL was actually launched, and I was there. I was also on the COAL committee. Jack and Sand will have to remind me, I know you're here, but they were convening or co-convening or something or other with the Cole Committee at that time. And I was briefly involved on the committee also at that time, I think as treasurer, a role that I did not cherish because I think all the bullshit with business activity statements had just come in, and that was a real pain in the ass for NGOs, as many of you will know, because it required endless reporting on what we had less and less time to actually do because we were too busy reporting on it. Sounds a little bit like working in a university, which has been my experience for a very long time. Anyway, so I didn't make Beijing, but I was at Beijing +5 and Beijing +10. And I'd like to talk a little bit about those because they reflect a significant shift from what things were like for lesbians in that space then and what they're like for lesbians in that space now. And Viviane will be able to report a little bit more on the now because she was at the CSW Zoom meeting, I believe, earlier this year or last year, and she can talk about that. But in 2000 and 2005, the main problems lesbians were confronting, because the NGOs with special consultative status, there are thousands of them. It's not like there are 2 or 3, there are lots of them. And unfortunately, religious fundamentalist organizations have that status too. So what we were dealing with in 2000 and 2005 was very strong anti-reproductive rights pushes by some of these groups, and including like harassing women in toilets and backing them up against the wall, and the sort of behaviour we've come to associate with trans-identified males now. But there were some quite vicious women from these groups that were intimidating people. The other big thing they were getting their knickers in a twist about was lesbians. So they'd come into lesbian meetings and try to disrupt them. So all the lesbian NGO parallel event meetings, we all went underground. So it was all by word of mouth or sort of telephone or guest ethnotries or whatever we were doing at that time. But, you know, we didn't have so much things as, you know, like the internet wasn't such a big thing then, even though it was starting. So it was actually quite an organisational challenge for lesbians then, because the main enemy was very clearly the right. I think the main enemy is still very clearly the right, but because I think trans ideology is fundamentally regressive ideology, but that's something we can talk about at another time. So that was sort of the experience, but we had a hell of a good time bonding with lesbians. We also in the women's NGO space, we had a chance, I forget whether it was 2000 or 2005, but Noeline Heiser, who was then director of UNIFEM, spoke to us quite eloquently about the fact that the women's sections of the UN had bugger all funding. Yeah. So what else is new? So when UN Women got created a few years ago, and the Vision for the Advancement of Women was one of the arms that got folded into UN Women along with UNIFEM. But those different women's sections of the, and UN Women is now the Secretariat for the Commission on Status of Women at the UN. But at the time, and I think still, what focuses on women in the UN has insufficient funding compared to a lot of other agencies of the UN, and that has been a perennial complaint. And UN Women was set up partly to try and address that and give women's issues higher status within the UN. Unfortunately, then we got transed, because around the time that UN Women was getting set up, we had SOGI, and the Yogyakarta Principles, which was, you know, LGBT alphabet soup rights, which was promoted by the then Louisa Arbour, I think her name was. She was from Quebec. She was then head of the Human Rights Council of the UN, and she pushed very heavily for these principles to be adopted by the Human Rights Council. And the Human Rights Council started doing research on homosexuality and gender identity and so on and so forth. One of the problems with the Yogyakarta Principles, and one of the significant departures from the Yogyakarta Principles from the Montreal Declaration, I was at the Montreal LGBT Human Rights Conference, which was a great conference in many respects, and there was a declaration that came out of that conference read out by Martina Navratilova, and it specifically mentioned violence against women. When the Yogyakarta Principles were developed, that reference disappeared. So anything that was woman-specific completely disappeared from the declaration. So we have now this sort of LGBT alphabet soup stuff competing with women's rights and with lesbian rights, and lesbians are just the first letter of an alphabet, and that's very tokenistic because it's not really about lesbian rights at all. So since that has developed within the UN framework and supported by most Western states, most Latin American states and a few others, it's been quite uphill battle for us as lesbians to have any sort of feminist voice within the UN space. And I haven't been involved in that area for a long time, but I know that Cole auspiced Women's Declaration International Forum at the NGO conference last year or this, I forget which, I think it was last year. And unfortunately, the timing was not very friendly for us in Australia, so I don't think I made any of them because they were all in the middle of the night. But because WDI doesn't currently have ECOSOC status, I think they're planning to apply for it in their own right. We'll see how that goes, given the brief that WDI has and given the pushback against sex-based rights. Fortunately, we still do have CEDAW, which does actually talk about sex-based rights. Hopefully that is not going to get changed. And if it does get changed, well, it has to be a whole new treaty. And that's a little bit more complicated than reforming the Sex Discrimination Act to add gender identity in Australia, which sort of passed through with barely a whisper and no consultation. But in the UN, they actually have to get a treaty, which means they have to get the member states to sign on to it. And I think they'll have trouble with that one. So hopefully we've still got CEDAW. A couple of other things very briefly before I hand over to, I think it's Viviane next. COAL has had, in the almost 30 years since its founding, it's had some sort of lulls and periods of activity, and the current committee came in after a bit of a lull. And we've been working hard to re-galvanise COAL. Unfortunately, that work has happened at the same time as there is increasing institutionalisation of transgender ideology and erosion of women's sex-based rights. So a lot of COAL energy has been taken up writing submissions to various state governments about their so-called gay conversion therapy bans, which are really a smoke screen for imposing transgender ideology in Australia. And various other laws that are coming in. We've also been involved. There was a survey run about what lesbians want. I wasn't very involved with that. Viviane might be able to talk more about that than I can because I wasn't very involved with that particular activity. I've just been centrally involved in writing a chapter that COAL has submitted or is about to submit to the WDI book that is going to come out next year. So that's very exciting. And we've set up a website, which Viviane will talk about. And just before I hand over, somebody in the chat mentioned something about ageing, and I can't remember in reference to what. But as COAL ages, our membership is also aging. Now, that's not necessarily a problem because associations come and go and there is renewal through other things. However, I'm really personally concerned that we have some intergenerational connection within COAL because we are the only lesbian organisation in Australia that is specifically focused on lesbian rights as sex-based rights. And we really need that defence of lesbian sex-based rights to be happening intergenerationally, because I know there are younger women who are concerned about this. But it is also it is a problem with every feminist organisation, that intergenerational renewal, and I think it is a challenge that's facing COAL right now. That's a personal reflection. Others may not agree. That's all for me. Thanks. ACON is the AIDS Council of New South Wales, which was, as the name suggests, set up in the period of the AIDS epidemic to specifically campaign around that. It has since expanded its reach. It's become more national in its reach, although its main funder remains the New South Wales government. But it is basically, it has copied Stonewall's Workplace Equality Index. It's copied Stonewall's lexicon of vocabulary. The Australian Broadcasting Commission has a gold tick. Special Broadcasting Service, which is our multicultural station, apparently also has a gold tick, if I remember correctly. And so it's really like the misnomer human rights organisation or human rights council, human rights something or other in the United States, which is a similar organisation which does the rainbow ticking stuff as well. So their influence is really quite significant and research, a recent research paper they put out, and we're currently looking at in Australian Feminist for Women's Rights, paper they recently put out says that, you know, X% of trans suffer, you know, Y% of violence and so on. We think those stats are a bit dodgy, because a lot of the papers we've looked at that cite these sorts of stats about the most vulnerable group are extremely dodgy. So we're looking into that. However, Australian media and state leaders are now citing that research as gospel truth. The preponderant influence of ACON, which is sort of like Stonewall down under, right, is appalling. As concerns lesbians in particular, for Lesbian Visibility Day this year, ACON featured a trans-identified male. That person was featured as the poster person for Lesbian Visibility Day. They had a man on their poster. That person was also featured in an Australian Broadcasting Commission very popular series called You Can't Ask That, where people are asked difficult questions about somewhat taboo subjects. And in the episode on lesbians, that person was also featured. So this sort of thing is the Australian Workplace Equality Index, the subservience of our media and our institutions to this ACON mantra, and to the fact that they, you know, lesbians no longer exist for them. They're men. I'm involved in a new group called Australian Feminist for Women's Rights, set up with the explicit aim of lobbying the new federal government, because we think this is a political opportunity and we wish to lobby the government coming explicitly from the political left about the impact of gender identity ideology. I've been currently working very hard on a document that presents some common assertions about trans rights and checks the facts. We're a small group, we're remaining small to keep focused, because we don't want to have endless conversations about process or strategy. We want to actually focus and get things done. So we have, not everyone who is a member of that group can be public as a member of that group because of risks to her in her workplace or in her political associations. So only a few of us, including myself, are prepared to stick our necks out and be public. Unfortunately, we are. But it is a real serious problem that women are suffering serious repercussions in their workplaces and in their political organisations or other organisations of which they're part, as we know. But because of what happened with the recent Australian federal election, those of you logging in from overseas may have heard about it, but a political candidate much favoured by the hard right of the Liberal Party, including the former Prime Minister, stood explicitly on a gender identity, a platform questioning gender identity. And there was much division in the feminist community about the logic of that choice. And I'm not going to rehearse those conversations now because I know there's disagreement. But it sort of turned the issue into a bit of a political football. The Greens dug in saying transgender rights are non-negotiable, blah-de-blah-de-blah. The right said, you know, we have to question gender identity. And Labor, which won the election, sort of dodged the question. And whenever the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, did answer a question, it went sort of in our direction. So that was somewhat encouraging. So there's a political opportunity to try and get some stuff done and get some things questioned. The CAS review and the recent decision of the NHS with the Tavistock Clinic, Alison Beatty's win, and some other developments are really very encouraging for us. Bill Shorten's decision on the terminology of mother, it's a small thing, but it's also a big thing in terms of pushing back against this ideology, and Shorten's right in that we need language that is intelligible to minority communities, to people who don't know necessarily what a cervix is, and so on, even native English speakers, and so on, that we're actually excluding a whole bunch of women when we use this terminology that is not intelligible to them. So those are the sorts of things I'm working on, and a whole bunch of other things to do with gender ideology, but we wish to do it from the left, because what's happened in Australia is that the issue has become framed as a left-right division in the wider political sphere, where a whole bunch of people in Australia don't really know what's going on, and if pressed on the question would probably say this is crazy, but they don't really get a voice. So we want to actually, so I'm sort of, my energy's a little bit taken up with that because I'm getting frustrated. I'm getting frustrated about having debates about, you know, whether supporting this candidate or that candidate is a good thing, having debates about we're just having rants about things without really developing a strategy. I want us to have a strategy. I'm not saying that COAL doesn't have a strategy, because COAL has done fabulous work, and particularly big thanks to Helen Daintree, who was on the committee, is no longer on the committee. She's taking a bit of a rest, but Helen did some colossal work on the submission to the Queensland government, and I think that work needs to be recognised. And other people also were involved in preparing submissions to various governments in COAL. So COAL's been, our lesbian workers sort of got hijacked by this issue, as you've all heard, and as other speakers have pinpointed. And that's frustrating for me as a lesbian, because I think there is a recreation of our lesbian spaces and our lesbian community and our lesbian culture as a former great generation is leaving us, as Susan very eloquently pointed out. We need that space. We need a space where younger lesbians can go, because at the moment we're driven underground, and all younger lesbians have is this sort of, alphabet soup bullshit. The only role models they have are, if you're butch, you're trans. That's sort of, to simplify it a little bit, but not by very much. So lesbians aren't getting that connection with feminist voices because we're being shut out. So it really is urgent for us as lesbians and as women that something shifts in the Australian polity. And I'm getting very impatient for that to happen, which is why I'm involved in this other group. I'm also doing stuff with COAL. I was, one of the main contributors to this chapter for the WDI book, along with Barbary.
Susan Hawthorne lives and works on Jiru country in far north Queensland. She joined the women's liberation movement in 1973. She quickly volunteered at Melbourne's Rape Crisis Centre. She has organised writers' festivals, been an aerialist in 2 women's circuses, taught English to Arabic-speaking women, and worked in Aboriginal education. She is the author of 29 books of fiction, poetry, and non-fiction. With Renata Klein, she founded Spinifex Press in 1991. She is adjunct professor in the School of Humanities at James Cook University, Townsville. Susan has won awards in writing, publishing, the gay and lesbian community, and in 2017 was winner of the Penguin Random House Best Achievement in Writing in the Inspire Awards for her work increasing people's awareness of disability. Her books include In Defence of Separation, 2019, Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, Lesbian Novels, The Falling Woman, 1992-2004, Le Men, 2013, and Dark Matters, 2017, and lesbian poetry collections, The Butterfly Effect, 2005, Cow, 2011, Lupa and Lamb, 2014, The Sacking of the Muses in 2019. You can find her work on the Spinifex Press site, and we will put up a link.
I respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their custodianship of the lands and waterways which have never been ceded. I live and work on Jiru country in far north Queensland. I also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. So I want to start talking about why the Coalition of Activist Lesbians. I joined the Coalition of Activist Lesbians sometime before 2008 when I co-wrote a submission to CEDAW along with Barbary Clark and Jack Draper. While I was not especially active in the years between 2008 and 2020 when I joined the committee, I always thought it was such a feat to get the NGO status with the UN ECOSOC, and that it was worth keeping it active. So thank you for explaining how that happened, Bronwyn. As the years passed, the importance of COAL has grown because lesbians are even more under attack today than they have ever been in my lifetime, except perhaps before I was a lesbian. I joined the Women's Liberation Movement in 1973, and it didn't take long to make the best decision of my life, namely to come out as a lesbian in 1974. By 1976, I was writing an essay called In Defence of Separatism, which was finally published in full in 2019. I've been involved in activism against rape, organising feminist literary and other art form festivals, being an aerialist in 2 women's circuses, but most of my work has been in publishing. Renata Klein and I set up Spinifex Press in 1991, specifically to publish radical feminist and lesbian writers across a range of different cultural groups and internationally. In this talk, I want to cover two main areas: the creative importance of an organisation like the Coalition of Activist Lesbians. What are the positive reasons why COAL exists? And why at this time, when lesbians are heavily under attack, it's critical to keep the Coalition of Activist Lesbians functioning and active. So, on the first, the creative importance of lesbians. Lesbians are an incredibly creative group of women. When you look back through the arts, sciences, humanities, you find lesbians have made some of the most important breakthroughs. Think of Virginia Woolf, Rachel Carson, just to name two major women whose work broke through the barriers, but many in the mainstream do not know that they were lesbians. Think of, and of course there are many, many others. Think of Suzanne Bellamy and Alex Dobkin, both of whom died in the last year. Alex Dobkin was one of the most upfront lesbians of the 1970s and 80s, loved by many of us who would sing along with her lyrics. I was lucky enough to have Alex do a show in our house in Melbourne around 2001 when she was on tour in Australia. Suzanne Bellamy has to be one of the most amazing artists and intellects of all time. I mean that. Her work is so original. I have written a piece in memory of Suzanne Bellamy, which is on the Spinifex website. While both were well loved by lesbians in many countries, they were frequently ignored by the mainstream, the male stream, who are simply not interested in talented women, and especially not interested in talented lesbians. It's lesbians who have done the critical work of protest and building organisations that work for all women. To name a few, mostly from Melbourne, where I lived for 50 years, Halfway House in Melbourne, the Rape Crisis Centre, the Women's Gallery in Brunswick Street, Fitzroy, the Women's Theatre Group, bands like Women's Electric Band, Melbourne, and Nice Girls Don't Spit, also in Melbourne, Clitoris, Sydney, Shameless Hussies, Adelaide, the Ovarian Sisters, Hobart, the Women's Circus and the Performing Older Women's Circus. There was also the No Men, No Meat restaurant in Collingwood, Melbourne, where we ate. In Victoria, there were 102 lesbian spaces and events. 96 of these have been lost. Of the 6 that still exist, 3 come under the umbrella of queer or are no longer spaces for lesbians. 3 remain: Spinifex Press, Ace Girls, a lesbian tennis group, and Matrix Guild. Matrix Guild provides social and housing and support for lesbians over 40. In the US, there's Old Lesbians Organising for Change, known as OLOC. In Germany, Graugenser, which means grey geese. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, there is Lilac and others. The women organising in these last 4 groups are many of the same women who organised activist, feminist and lesbian organisations in the 1970s. And here we are at the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, still at it. I hope that through the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, we can do more than put the names and works of lesbians prominently on the website. But it is a work in progress. And as we all contribute to it, it will grow and it will come to fruition soon. Attacks on lesbians. The other major reason why the Coalition of Activist Lesbians is so important is because lesbians are under massive attack. This is happening in several ways. The forces arrayed against lesbians most strongly are the transgenderists, trans rights activists, TRAs, LGBTQA+ and queer activists, all of which constitute reactionary men's rights activists, MRAs, including incels. Upfront attacks by physical and verbal violence, using legal forces, suing, making unnecessary and vicious complaints to police, tactics of cancelling, as well as online attacks through hacking, frivolous complaints to service providers, and more. TRAs have been taking lesbians, trans rights activists have been taking lesbians out of the picture since 1994 in Australia. And they were already hanging around before that. But in 1994, they undermined the purchase of a building for the Sydney lesbian-space project and divided lesbians sufficiently that eventually the building was sold and the funds returned to the mostly lesbians who donated for a lesbian building. In 2000, a he said he was a trans woman, that is a man, said he wanted to join the Women's Circus, which was set up to work with women who were survivors of sexual assault. I was a member at the time and protested very loudly. As a result of being sidelined, I left the circus for a year, for the year it took for him to withdraw his application, which I had suggested right at the beginning. A year in which the circus became divided and trust was lost. In Adelaide, a group called Sappho's Party was set up so lesbians could meet privately. It was shut down through legal action by trans. The Lesbian Festival in Melbourne was also made illegal. While a trans man can never be a lesbian, too often the courts, the media and governments side with the trans lobby. In Australia, ACON, through the Australian Workforce Equality Index, AWEI, is spruiking inclusivity with major government and corporate organisations. Sponsorship for the recent ACON 2022 awards include KPMG, Amex, the Australian Tax Office, the SBS, the Special Broadcasting Service, BHP, Deutsche Bank, and others. It's really very horrifying. The other method, which is quite sinister, is that of silencing, erasing, ignoring, astroturfing, and providing massive funding to organisations who kowtow to the transgender lobby. Organisations that used to be lesbian focused are now so inclusivity as to be useless. And they include all kinds of trans and binary people, including men with penises who call themselves lesbians, a major doublethink. COAL, along with many other lesbian and feminist organisations in different countries, is an important force for keeping lesbians informed about these strategies, the ways in which we are undermined and silenced. While there have been some successes, they are minuscule in comparison with what the trans lobby has achieved. In my book, Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, I follow the money trail. There is no money trail for lesbians. Lesbians rely on crowdfunding, the occasional bequest from a lesbian who has died, or in-kind voluntary work. By contrast, the trans lobby is funded by billionaires and, as above, corporates and government bodies. We need a groundswell. We need support for lesbian organisations like the Coalition of Activist Lesbians. Thank you. One of the things that I've done recently is I'm involved in an international independent publishers group, and they've done a best practice outline project, and I was really horrified to see that they included feminist and LGBTIQ plus together, and so I wrote a document challenging that. The irony is that there's actually no mention of any trans in the actual document, but they seem to think that it's a good idea to put these two things together. And so I suggested, well, give us a feminist group and give us an LGBTIQ plus. And I've actually just begun recently to use the terminology TQ plus, because really that's where the similarity is. It has nothing to do with LGB, has nothing to do with sexual orientation, has nothing to do with lesbians. As Bronwyn said before, the L is just like an overhang from the past. They know they can't cut it, and they take over all of the organisations, including one called Australia, which used to be a international lesbian organisation, and now is so completely captured that it's useless. So while I did protest against this, I was then told off for that we're not allowed to make transphobic comments. So I wrote back and said, disagreement is not a phobia. And I haven't heard back since. That was about a week ago. So it's really pretty extraordinary. And I did suggest they go and have a look at the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights if they want to educate themselves. I tried to be polite.